So our next speaker is going to be Dr. Scott Grantham, who's the medical director for the Laureate Psychiatric Hospital and Clinic.
Hello. Well, thank you. Thank you for that welcome. I'm very pleased to be here, very excited to be here, honored to be a part of such a distinguished panel. I'm going to try to keep a brisk pace because I'm excited about taking some questions. But also there are some far more important people than me behind me who probably have busy schedules today. So I will try to get through this in a way that is both helpful to you, but also pretty concise. So I want to talk to you today about not the science surrounding the issue, but about just the day-to-day practical considerations that we face under this new way of doing things. And not because I think I have all the answers or even maybe any of the answers, but because I hope that if all stakeholders in this new paradigm can just recognize these challenges and can understand their complexity, then maybe we can be a bit more patient with or less prone to frustration with each other as these details get ironed out. So we're going to look at this from three different perspectives. The first being the perspective of a hospital administrator, the second being the perspective of a clinic director or maybe a lead partner in a group of physicians, and the third being from the perspective of a rank and file frontline physician. So first let's talk about hospitals and the physicians that practice there. When this initiative was passed, most of the conversation at hospitals revolved around what are we going to do to accommodate these new rules? What are we going to do to respond to this development? And the most obvious question that comes to mind is, what are we going to do about patients who have a license for medical marijuana when they come to our hospital to get treatment? And so medical marijuana doesn't, of course, and no one would ever suggest this, make you immune to any of the other maladies that can affect us. And so you're still going to have individuals who get injured in some way, have a heart attack, have a stroke, and need hospitalization. And perhaps their medical marijuana usage is for a condition, a chronic condition that is incidental to the reason that they're being admitted for acute medical care in a hospital, but it still has to be addressed. And so at the health system where I work, there was a series of meetings to address these types of concerns. One thing I want to explain about how hospitals make decisions is all medications or other therapies and their use and their approval tends to be routed through a specialized committee. At most places it's called the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee. At other places it might be called something else, but there's essentially a set governing body for what kind of treatments are allowed at the hospital as a gatekeeping type of service. And one of the core functions of that body is to maintain a hospital formulary. That's a list of medications that are allowed to be used at the hospital, and that formulary list also directs the hospital pharmacy to acquire and maintain an adequate supply of those medications. And so that was the first issue that came up as we thought about addressing these developments. And it quickly became apparent that medical marijuana, because of this new paradigm, this new way of doing things, was not going to fit into the usual types of categories available in our formulary. The most obvious example of which would be that it's not specifically FDA approved for a condition. And so if it's not going to be included into your formulary like some other type of medicine, then the next question you have to answer is, then what will you do with the marijuana that patients present with on campus or their request to continue using while they're in the hospital? And so that's a very difficult question to think. There are a lot of different facets to that, but it almost always necessitates some plan some kind of policy for offering the patients a way for any supply that they have with them to be securely stored so that it can be safely returned to them upon discharge. Fortunately, we already have a process in place because patients are in the habit of bringing medications to the hospital, some of which might be controlled substances themselves, and so this exists, and so that part was a bit easier to figure out than some of these larger questions, but that's something that each health system or hospital has to decide for themselves. Brings up some interesting questions. No policy can address every type of conceivable scenario, but it does bring to mind situations in which maybe a patient would prefer that their supply be sent home for safekeeping, but what if the friend or loved one that accompanied them did not have themselves a license? Is there going to be adequate labeling on the substance for that individual who's willing to volunteer to take on that responsibility to avoid any kind of trouble? Well, I think that's an interesting question for law enforcement or something that might be adjudicated down the line. Next, you think about visitors who have a medicinal marijuana license, and how are you going to respond to potentially their request to take their dosing on hospital property? It seems that the most common strategy for addressing this has become to conceptualize marijuana in the same way that tobacco is conceptualized as far as policies addressing its use on property. And so I expect that you'll notice at most hospital campuses that the tobacco restrictions that have become much of an industry standard will also apply to medicinal marijuana. Of course, much easier to enforce that policy when the marijuana is in smokable form. If somebody takes a small dose of an edible, it's obviously less apparent, and so it's important to realize that these policies, their goal is not to eliminate the use of all tobacco and marijuana on a particular property, but more about just promoting a sense of comfort and wellness amongst patients, visitors, and staff. The next, you have to think of things as a large employer, which all hospitals are, and so how are you going to address staff use and modify your human resources policies? Fortunately, the initiative included some guidance for us here, and we'll look forward to maybe additional guidance from the state legislature in the future. But you can see that you are not to discriminate against a potential employee based upon their status as a license holder unless it would jeopardize participation in or funding from a federal program. I'll touch on that again in a minute because it's more complicated than it sounds. But it also sees also says that the holder cannot be sanctioned simply for a negative drug test, but there is a provision for if they're using their medicinal marijuana during work. So any large operation is going to have different employee cohorts, and these different cohorts have to get along and have to understand what one another are doing. What does this look like for the physicians that work at the hospital? Physicians some feel uncomfortable with the uncertainty about the objective testing of the use of a patient's marijuana, as far as the tests that we have being readily available, being qualitative tests, meaning they just detect the presence or absence of cannabis, but not being useful in a quantitative sense, in that test in and of itself is not going to give you any information about how often or how much someone is using, and that kind of uncertainty is going to affect physicians' willingness to incorporate themselves into the treatment process. Also, physicians who are on the outside of the process looking in may have some doubts about the utility of communicating with the physician that made the recommendation. As we heard in the previous presentation, there's not a required follow-up interval or a mechanism to change or to modify the recommendation, and whether it is true that contacting the physician would have any utility or not. I think it's if it's the physician's perception that it would not have any utility, then that's probably going to influence them in a way that prevents them from doing so. Also, if you think about being a physician that's caring for a patient who has a recommendation from another physician, you will be in a position to address and work with the patient on a alternative therapy if you're responsible for their care in an inpatient setting that does not allow medicinal marijuana. And so what is that going to look like? We don't have an easy replacement strategy or a standard way to respond to any type of discontinuation type of discomfort that a chronic consumer might have, unlike the way that we have nicotine replacement products that are used so commonly in hospitals that don't allow smoking. Finally, you can see individual practice habits differing amongst different clinicians, and that has probably been the case since the beginning of the medical profession, at least when it started to differentiate into different specialties. And so that's not uncommon, but in addition to simple practice habits, there's also differences in skills or knowledge, and even beyond that, differences in the level of privileging or credentialing or certification that physicians have. And so when you think about a large organization that may have 500, 600 physicians, when you're thinking about policies to enact or guidance to give to those physicians, you have to keep these things in mind because it's not so simple as a one-size-fits-all. You might have a physician covering a patient this week that has the skills and the privileges to manage something like medicinal marijuana, but then their partner that comes on the following week may not share those skills, may not have those privileges. So next, let's look at the clinic perspective and the importance of being consistent and simple. Again, when you have a large operation, it's important that your policies be easily remembered by your organization's members and easy to adhere to. So one very simple problem we encountered early on in conversations about how to respond to this change was, where do we document the use of medicinal marijuana in the medical record? It has become commonplace for hospitals and health systems to use electronic medical record software. It's far less common for records to be simply handwritten, and so that puts a restriction of some sorts onto how you document, in that much medical documentation now is entering discrete data fields instead of just handwriting the information that you wish to communicate. In most electronic medical record systems, medical marijuana just simply doesn't fit into those discrete data fields that are in the medications section. For instance, it will want you to select a specific molecule or FDA-approved agent name, or maybe a brand name, and then a specific dosage and frequency and route of administration. And so that became a barrier to placing medical marijuana information in the medication section. Having a license for medical marijuana is not a condition in and of itself, and so it's not a natural fit into the medical history section, which includes diagnoses like hypertension or COPD, things that an individual experiences, and so that wasn't a very practical option. And then also having or being a license holder does not constitute having a use disorder, and so there's not much relevance to putting it into the substance abuse or use section. And so although different entities or agencies are likely to solve this problem in different ways, our solution, at least for now, is to include it in the social history, which has for many years in medicine been the most eclectic section, has the most diverse information in it. Currently, the plans are to simply record whether or not the patient reports being a medical marijuana license holder. That's the plan at our health system. I'm not aware of what other systems plan to do about this. Just a few words about medical staff governance. Physicians have a tremendous amount of autonomy when practicing as an individual. When they practice in groups, though, there are layers of rules or expectations put upon them, particularly if they're practicing at a hospital, which state law requires to have an organized medical staff. And so you'll see there's, much like government rules, there's medical staff equivalents, there's bylaws that are like the Constitution, and then rules and regulations that are like the laws of the land. But then you have privileging documents which determine what types of procedures or treatments any individual physician is allowed to provide. But then you have employment agreements if the hospital is actually your employer as well. So each of these have different requirements or expectations put on the physician, and in the build-up to and even now in the immediate aftermath, these documents are all silent on the issue of medical marijuana, and so it's led to some scrambling on the part of organized medical staffs to try to incorporate this new therapy into our governance. Also, it's not just about rules, but it's also about peer review and performance improvement initiatives. So physicians largely govern themselves in the sense that it is peers that we respond to when we're accused of not just malpractice, but even if there's been a recognized opportunity to improve your practice. And so we have things like, oops, that's not the laser pointer, sorry. Here we go. So we have focused professional practice evaluation and ongoing professional practice evaluation. This is when you join a medical staff or if a problem's been recognized by a peer on the medical staff. These are typically a series of cases that are reviewed. Ongoing professional practice evaluation can vary from hospital to hospital, but it's usually done at about a 10-month or 12-month interval, and that's just how the medical staff provides surveillance on itself and its individual members to ensure that they're meeting the standard of care. But then peer review actions, those are things that can be taken as the organized medical staff as a body if it believes that an individual physician is in need of changing some practice habits or gaining some additional education. I mentioned the complexity of federal programs and payments. So the initiative did mention that there's an exception for employing someone with a license to hold medical marijuana if federal funding or participation is jeopardized. But the one comment I have about that is that these are all just examples of different federal payment or federal programs. This is a Medicare payment program. This is another Medicare payment program for physician compensation. CMS standards are a long list of things that hospitals are expected to meet in order to continue to participate in Medicare, which is synonymous with simply being able to conduct business because of the importance of being able to participate in Medicare. But then each commercial insurance program has their own quality initiatives and their own way of rating hospital systems and health systems. And so it is very difficult to actually determine what, if any, federal funding and how much might be jeopardized. And so I think that's led to much of the hesitation on the part of large systems because this is definitely easier to say, but harder to operationalize. And then many health systems have ethical and religious guidelines. So we have two large Catholic health systems in town, and so you also have the influence of those documents or those expectations on what kind of medicine is provided. So I want to end by just talking about some of the sources of confusion and misunderstanding from the perspective of individual frontline physicians. So this, in some ways, has been perceived by physicians as just another program with rules. So I have provided a list here of things that have been enacted in the past 5 or 6 years. Each of these things has a different set of rules or expectations for physicians, some of which include a mechanism for sanctioning a physician if they don't adhere to the program. And so by January 1st of 2020, we'll be required to all have e-prescribing mechanisms for controlled substances, but that requires dual authentication technology. And I could keep going on and on forever, but it's a very technical process. Buprenorphine waivers and methadone waivers. Now that methadone's been around since the 1970s, buprenorphine 1990s, I believe, or year 2000. But those are additional certifications and additional training that you must do if you want to provide those medications to patients. The clozapine, that's an antipsychotic medication that you have to register with a specific website and submit regular lab values to if you want to provide that treatment to patients. Senate Bill 1446 was recently passed and has a variety of different requirements for prescribing opioid medications to patients with acute or chronic pain. And the medical treatment law deals with end-of-life issues, and the prescription monitoring programs, the software database that we are required to check before we provide certain controlled substance prescriptions to patients. And so you can see that it is becoming a lot for physicians to remember and adhere to, and there is some fear that you could inadvertently jeopardize your licensing or otherwise be sanctioned by the state or some other entity like the medical board simply for doing things the traditional way, or the way that we learned in medical school and residency, which was simply write the patient a prescription on paper and have them take it to the pharmacy. And then there's the question of what if two physicians disagree. This could become problematic when physicians in the same group who are covering for each other disagree, but it is not, I want to just end with a comment that it's not uncommon for physicians to disagree. We've seen this over the years in many different issues. So you can see that cardiologists and OBGYN specialists disagree about estrogen in older females, and the cardiologist will take patients off of it, and the OB-GYN will put them back on. And family practice and psychiatry have robust dialogues about certain kinds of sleep aids, and of course the opioid use disorders brought chronic opioid therapy to the forefront. And then I don't know that I've ever seen a neurologist and a neurosurgeon agree on whether or not somebody should be on anti-seizure medicines for a certain period of time. So I think that there's a precedent for this, and I think that there's optimism that these things, as time goes by, can be reconciled. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Grantham. So I think we'll open it up with questions from the audience. Anybody have a question? Just raise your hand. Okay. Any questions? Oh, okay. Yes.
If there's a lot of international research on this, on these topics, how come it's not being quoted in conferences?
By physicians and physician researchers? Well, sure. I think there are robust academic dialogues going on at events like this, maybe to a lesser extent than some other events, but most individual practicing physicians are far removed from the academic dialogues. I mean, they're in the sphere of well-established and mainstreamed treatments, because on a day-to-day basis, you see common illnesses that have very common treatment protocols. And so I think there is a distinction between the physicians who are more at the vanguard of this issue and having these debates, and more of the frontline medical staffs that you're going to encounter if you go to emergency room or urgent care. And those who are less involved in the debate are anxiously awaiting some clarification, some reconciliation, some guidelines about these things. But I'd say the average physician doesn't want to be the first to do something. You don't want to be the last to do something either, but you want to be squarely in the middle.
Yeah, and I also suspect that some of the research that's being done in Europe and Canada with respect to a cannabis-like compound that a company is making, you can look for randomized controlled trials in the research databases, and I would imagine there's more and more of that happening. So I would guess that some of that will arrive over time. Another question that came in related to the town hall. So Dr. Grantham, you're a consultation liaison psychiatrist, so you see a lot of patients in the ER. And this may somewhat relate to you. The question was, what do I tell my chronic pain patients regarding the amount or dose of THC to use? Is that a question that sort of comes up often in terms of the emergency room settings, or you see patients who are experiencing chronic pain and ask you that?
We haven't yet, and I think it's because we're waiting on the supply and the distribution to get out there to more commonly encounter that. But it is going to be difficult. I don't know that there's a good analogy for a similar situation, in the sense that you may be engaged in a treatment that potentially a majority of physicians would decline to give you a recommendation on. And we all have our limits. I mean, I won't recommend to a patient whether or not they should proceed with their amputation because I'm a psychiatrist and not an infectious disease expert or orthopedic surgeon. But it could be difficult for the patients who choose this therapy to get advice. And that's why I'm interested to see how the follow-up interval develops at clinics that are advertising themselves as specialty clinics for this, because I don't know that you are necessarily going to get it from your primary care physician, at least not at this early stage.
Okay. We'll have time for one question if it's a quick one.
All right. Well, about dosing, what I have found is that since we all have a different mitochondria, we're all completely different, and since marijuana and CBD is an herb, that people have to just find out what works for them. You start out low, and if the pain goes away, or if it doesn't go away, you take a little bit more, and then if it continues, then you take a little bit more, because you cannot OD on it. And I'm just wondering if you, and I know it's difficult, because as doctors, you're used to just having that clinical research, as you know, from a drug perspective, you know, it's all about dosing. And so, I mean, I understand the confusion that physicians are having, because this is revolutionary, because it's an herb, and it's kind of like, almost like taking vitamin C.
And I'm sorry, what is the question?
Well, I just said, did you have difficulty in that perspective, that you're waiting for it to be treated like a drug, when really CBD is a supplement, and we're all so different.
So,
and I know you guys are kind of just catching up to this.
Sure. No, and like I mentioned, we just don't have a good analogy to put it to, and so everybody's searching for that. But it's not uncommon for physicians to need to find a level of comfort with ambiguity. But that's where the communication between the patient and the physician is so important, because if the patient is asking or expecting specific instructions about something that the physician just isn't knowledgeable about, then that's important to reconcile. The physician needs to explain, like, well, I don't have a specific recommendation for you in that way, but I do have some education to talk to you about. And so there's going to have to be movement, I think, on both sides to more clearly articulate the expectations and capabilities of each, because it is something new and different for doctors, and they just may not be able to give advice in the way that the patients are accustomed to receiving it.
So, yeah, if you think back to that pyramid that Dr. Paulus showed at the beginning, in terms of levels of evidence. You know, as physicians, what you look for is a level of evidence that's at the highest level, which usually comes from a randomized controlled trial. And so the challenge is, if you're going to look at cannabis in the same lens as a pharmacological drug, there's just not yet the infrastructure to have that level of evidence within the U.S. Certainly, we can look to other countries that allow that type of research, but most of the research, medical research, traditionally has happened between the U.S. and Europe. So the fact that you're not able to conduct this kind of research at a large scale, I think, is rather limiting. So we're going to have to move on. Sorry, we have to stay on schedule for our speakers, but thank you very much, Dr. Grantham. And
thank you all. Thank you.
And so in spirit of keeping us on schedule,